Protests have continued across America for the sixth consecutive night following the death of George Floyd last week. Curfews have been imposed in 40 cities and the National Guard are patrolling the streets.
Well, before we talk in more depth about the unfolding events, let's remind ourselves of what happened last week. We want to warn you that this video contains distressing images.
Well, in just a moment, we'll speak to lawyer and political rights activist Dr. Shola Mos-Shogbamimu and Dr. Zoe as well. But first, let's go to Sam Rubin in the city of Los Angeles, where it's just after 2 a.m. The curfew is in place. Good morning to you, Sam.
Morning,
Tell me what's the city like now?
I think, Phillip and Holly, good morning to the two of you. It's definitely a calmer Sunday night into Monday morning than it was Saturday night into Sunday. This imposition of the curfew has certainly taken people off the street. I think has served to give the police an opportunity to conduct widespread arrests. They did so last night. And consequently, what seemed like a city on a verge of an eruption, I think, at least in Los Angeles, that has been quelled to a large degree.
Sam, your reaction to this, you said that, you were angry, you were exhausted with it, but sadly you weren't surprised.
Well, I think as you reviewed with that video, there's no question, Holly, that a tape like this would generate immediate action and immediate upset. And the dilemma is the images we're looking at now are of looting. It has nothing to do with what we're looking at this precise moment, which were peaceful protests taking place in Los Angeles and elsewhere in the country. So you're seeing a bifurcated circumstance. You are seeing peaceful protests everywhere. And then it appears that in many cities, there's a contingent of what I will describe simply as others who are opportunistic and deeply cynical, I think, and taking advantage of the protests to then begin the looting and the violence. These do not start off, for the most part, around the country as violent protests. They're trying to communicate a message of upset and outrage, a message which is absolutely, completely justifiable.
And although Twitter has since removed it, Donald Trump tweeted, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." What's the general feeling about the president's reaction to this?
That he has been 100% not helpful. The fact that yesterday the president did not appear in front of the cameras was a deliberate admission of his inability, a startling inability to provide any kind of leadership or rallying cry or ability to calm. He doesn't want to calm. One thing that political observers have pointed out is that with deep regret, these violent images, I think, play into his hands politically. Like, things are in chaos. He's the only one who can straighten things out. I hope that doesn't really permeate. But we're embarrassed by our president.
He was rushed into an underground bunker on Friday, wasn't he, from the White House, when that certainly when the protests managed to bubble up there?
For a brief period of time, Philip. But the fact of the matter is, again, it's that distinction between sort of the headline and what's really happening. There have been very aggressive and loud protests out in front of the White House, but not for a second is the security of the White House itself as a structure or the president ever compromised. That's not the case, nor has ever been the case.
Okay.
But yes, there are people angry in Washington, D.C. and in cities coast to coast. There's no question about that. And I say this not as a political commentator, I'm not one, but he's not been helpful, and he hasn't led in any appreciable way.
All right, Sam, thank you for joining us this morning. Let's bring in Dr. Shola and Dr. Zoe now. Thank you both for joining us today. Dr. Shola, I wanted to start with you first of all, and just to get your first initial feelings, like the rest of us, when you saw that horrific footage of George Floyd.
Hi, Holly. Look, for me, there's one resounding question that emanates from the frustration that I feel many people, the anger, the pain of the continued dehumanization of Black lives at the hands of racism, because that is what we saw. And that question is, when will white people progress? And I'm not just talking about the US, I'm talking about the UK as well. I'm talking about the fact that there's a lack of fundamental understanding of what racism is as a power construct created by white nations to deny an equal value of life and liberty to Black people for the benefit of white people. It doesn't mean all white people or racist, it means white people have privilege. It means institutional racism is entrenched in society. So if a white person does not use their white privilege to stop the racism perpetuated by other white people and institutions, it is because their way of life is predicated on the denial of an equal value of life and liberty for Black people. And you know what's sad, Holly, is that there are going to be some white folks listening to this truth I've just spoken, who will be very uncomfortable about it. It's the reasons for their discomfort that differs. There'll be white folks who hear this truth, and immediately this will be a wake-up call that, oh my God, there's so much more work to be done.
Is what needs
What
to
can
be
I
done
do to
then?
help?
Do you need to, if you are feeling uncomfortable hearing this now, do you need to look into that uncomfortable place and understand or learn the reasons why you're feeling uncomfortable? Because there's a reason for that. Does it start there?
So I am not feeling uncomfortable, but for the white folks listening to the truth who are feeling uncomfortable, as I said, some of them will immediately see this as a wake-up call that there's so much more work to be done. What can I do? While other white folks will be immediately enraged by it and seek to whitewash the oppression of Black people as their own so that they can call us anti-white. So yes, the question is, when will white people progress to the level where they understand that there is no such thing as reverse racism by Black people and generations of white people, because there is no power construct to make it remotely feasible for Black people to deny an equal value of life and liberty to white people. So white people have never experienced racism, not yesterday, today, or tomorrow. Prejudice, like all of us, yes. Bias, like all of us, yes. But racism, heck no. If a white person ever experienced racism, it should have ended 400 years ago. So what needs to happen now is to end the weaponization of whiteness on our streets, in our schools, in politics, in the workplace, in the justice system, in the economy. Because it is when we start that ending of weaponization of the whiteness that we can start to talk about solutions. So the question to which the solution is the answer is, when will white people start to progress? Because think about it, in the UK, if we do not end the weaponization of whiteness, we will continue to have the Russian Charles, the Sean Riggs, the Sarah Reeds, the Stephen Lawrence. And in the States, we will continue to have the George Floyds, the Breonna Taylors, the Ahmaud Arbery's. This has to end. Yeah. It has to end.
Absolutely.
There are just some of those names that you mentioned there, Dr. Shola. Ahmaud Arbery, 23-year-old Black man, shot dead by 2 white men in America in February. Amy Cooper last week in America, a white woman called the police after a Black man in a park innocently asked her to put her dog on a lead. And so the stories continue.
Yeah.
And just briefly, Shola, with you, you say that you were angry, obviously, and you were also exhausted because this fight, this 400-year fight, must be exhausting for everybody.
Yes. And then having to explain it. It's because, you see, Phil, the overt and covert racism is excused by many. The institutional cover-up of racism is blatant and staggering. You see, that is why I said racism is a power construct that is not controlled by Black people. It's not controlled by people of color. It's controlled by institutions controlled by white people, which is why we need our white siblings to come in to the fold and exercise their privilege to stop the racism perpetrated by other white people and by institutions, to not allow this continued narrative that when we speak out against the oppression we experience of racism, to not allow that narrative of saying that we are anti-white, to not allow the narrative of making us to whitewash our oppression so that it can be owned by white people. I mean, you've never heard of reverse anti-Semitism, have you? Have you ever heard of reverse homophobia or Islamophobia? But there are people in these marginalized groups who speak out against that oppression. So why is it that it's the oppression of Black people that is immediately whitewashed, appropriated immediately in order to turn our pain, our frustration, our anger, our suffering into somebody else's own? The weaponization of whiteness must be recognized as part of the reason that systemic racism continues.
Let me use that phrase with Zoe, actually, who's waiting patiently here. Zoe, Dr. Shola says we need to end the weaponization of whiteness.
I think My point I want to make is that there are so many people who are white who will be watching this, who will feel quite confused, I think, and they'll feel quite like they don't know what their role is in this, but what are they being asked to do? And I think it's got to start with all of us looking at our own behaviours. And if people do feel uncomfortable, feel curious about that and ask yourself why, and start to unpick biases. Most people in this country do not believe that they are racist, and they're not racist in that overt way. But most people will have at some point, and this may not just be white people, it might be black people as well, it might be Asian people, will have had behaviours where they have responded or reacted in a certain way because of a person's skin colour. And we need to make sure that we are not passing that down to our children. So I would say to anybody out there who has children, if you do one thing, talk about this at the dinner table, have conversations with your children, teach your children about racism and that it is not acceptable and we must all be anti-racist, because many of us, without even knowing, we may have locked that car door because a black man was approaching the car. Our children will be picking up on that. We haven't intentionally taught them that, but that's what we're teaching them. And the way to unpick that is to all of us have those conversations in the households with our children, with our neighbours, with our friends, with our families. And that's where it starts. It starts at home by discussing it, being open and honest about it, and having a real look at ourselves and our own behaviours and identifying where perhaps we have responded in a certain way because of a person's skin colour without really being aware of it unconsciously.
There has been, as we've seen, a lot of violence in America. I wanted to play this clip, and this is a clip from North Carolina, and there's three men here. There's an older gentleman who the violence is unfolding, and he's saying, what else do we do? We've tried everything else. What else do we do to be heard? There's a man in his 30s that's saying, this is not the way, this is not the way. And there's a 16-year-old boy who is looking at these two men, just not knowing which is the right way to go. And off the back of this, Dr. Shola, I just want to ask you what you would have said to that 16-year-old boy. Let's have a look.
He angry at 46. I'm angry at 31. You angry at 16. Putting yourself in harm's way is not the way.
No, it's not.
You and then other your counterparts the same age and that has that same power. Y'all come up with a better way. Because we ain't doing it.
Oh, my God.
I mean, there is generations of pain right there. So, Dr. Shola, what would you have said to that 16-year-old? What is the right way?
Oh my God, that video broke me when I watched it.
Yeah, me too.
And the 16-year-old's reaction is actually similar to my 14-year-old when she watched the George Floyd's arrest. And my daughter, she didn't even watch it to the end. She started crying. She was so angry. She broke down. Her anger was expressed in tears. And she kept saying to me, Mommy, why? Why, Mommy? And you know what I said to my child? I held her close. For me, knowledge is her protection, not hiding her from such truths. And so I started to have a conversation with her about what the reality, why it happens, what is happening, what solidarity with white allies look like, and why her generation, it's important for her generation to learn from our generation and previous generations as to what needs to happen next, how we need to change the shift in institutions to ensure a better quality of life and choice for Black people.
Can I ask both of you, just we've got to be brief now, I'm afraid, but Dr. Shola, when you see those pictures of looting, you see a protest that was initially peaceful, that then becomes a violent protest, that then turns into looting. Do the pictures that we're seeing here of that looting dilute the message?
I think that at the rate that we've gotten to right now, looting, of course, of businesses is not something that I support, but we need to understand the injustice that led to the looting. Because those who are rioting, for instance, they have experienced looting for their entire life. So we need to understand, rooting out the injustice that led people to come out on the streets because they felt, you know what, we've been looted. This has to stop now. So the looting, for me, as I said, the looting isn't right. Is a
violent protest inevitable with something like this?
Oh, Phil, I think that a violent protest is inevitable, to be honest with you. The anger and the frustration has reached epic levels, to which, of course, President Trump is not helping by saying when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And it doesn't mean violence is the way, but again, it's generations of this dehumanization. Black people are saying you expect us to abide by the rules, but you are not abiding by the rules. You are violating our rights every single day. You're shooting us at home. You're calling the police on us. You are denying us justice in the justice system. You are denying us equal accessibility at work. How much more do you want us to take? Our children are sent out of school because of their hairstyle. You call us by negative stereotypes that don't identify with who we are. How much more are we meant to take? That is what you're saying. So the violent and non-violent protests, I think that eventually, one way or the other, you and I will probably be having this conversation 10 years from now, which is unfortunate, 20 years from now, if, as I say, the weaponization of whiteness does not end.
Final words, Zoe.
Well, I think, there will be opportunists. There are people who are being opportunistic and looting, and that is not okay. But I think the question I would ask is, if all of this protesting was being done peacefully, if people weren't rioting, and if violence wasn't happening, would we be having this conversation on This Morning today? And if the answer to that question is no, then it's not the answer on its own, but it's part of the answer if that's what it's required for the world to wake up and have these conversations.
Thank you both very much. Thank you.